So it strikes me that at all scales, much of our lives involve sort of stumbling from one crisis to another crisis, and we end up in places that maybe we never intended to go to because, you know, we're always just navigating the immediate. And one way to get out of that is to try to think about what futures might be, and that is the scenario exercise. It's not about prediction, because if we knew what the future was, that would be easy. You know, that would be trivial. So we actually have to. We're trying to imagine what's over the horizon. We, by definition, can't see it, but that doesn't mean that we can imagine anything. Okay, we actually have to have a sort of a disciplined imagining, an internally consistent imagining, and that's what we try to do with scenarios. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a very long-standing history of doing scenarios around climate change, and they've had a process running probably for the last 6 years or so. I got very frustrated with the process because it didn't deliver anything in terms for the fifth assessment. But when it finally delivered, I actually found their scenarios to be quite compelling. And I went to a meeting where they presented them, and I immediately started thinking about some things which have long been interests of mine. And that is, how do scenarios scale? So these are global scenarios, suggested how the world might evolve over the next sort of century. And I started thinking, well, what does that mean when you see them from an African perspective? And that's what I'm going to try and unpack today. And it's me thinking aloud, and I will try to be quite brief about it so that we will have time to actually co-imagine these scenarios, because that's the most powerful thing about scenarios. It's not the end point, it is in fact the thinking that goes into how that might come about. So I'm not going to unpack all the deep background around how these scenarios were arrived at, and they were thought of in the context of global change, which is why they organized around the adaptation mitigation space. I'm just going to take them as starting points and say, look, here are 5 views of a global future. If that global future transpires, what might it look like in Southern Africa or in Sub-Saharan Africa, and what kind of interventions would it take for us to get onto that path rather than a different path? So there's a couple of issues here. You know, the future is this notion that you've already been introduced with, the idea that the future doesn't, although we can't see the future, in retrospect, it always was with us. We just failed to recognize it. And so what we're trying to see in the SEEDS project is, you know, could we get better at actually seeing what might be good futures? And when we talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, there are certain conditions here, a prism, if you like, that we need to translate these international, these global views through. And specifically, Sub-Saharan Africa over the next at least 50 years, and probably a bit more, is the only place that has not yet gone through the demographic transition. In other words, we still have relatively high positive growth rates. Now, for many people, that's a great concern, because, you know, how are we going to manage with supplying the needs of all those people? Of course, for many business people and economists, I think that's the most wonderful thing. This is the last place in the world that actually has a growing market. So, you know, you can see it from both sides. So that gives us a very youthful age profile, but it also means there's this you know, dramatic urbanization going on all over Africa. Secondly, you know, the world faces an enormous challenge of providing food over the next half century, and the calculations are that food production has to double essentially by 2050. The reason for that is not only that the global population is still going up, but more importantly, the global consumption patterns are changing, and that's the bigger driver of it, in fact. But to satisfy that, production has to sort of double. Most places in the world can't do that by lateral expansion of agricultural area. So it has to be through intensification. In Africa, there's still scope for lateral expansion, and there's this whole debate in the futures of Africa about what is the balance between expanding the area under cropland versus increasing the intensity and the production per unit area on cropland. Africa is highly exposed to climate change, both for geographical reasons and for social reasons. So particularly here in southern Africa, but also in the Sahel, we're in the descending limbs of the Hadley cells. This is this area, that's why we get global deserts, in those locations. And all of our modeling suggests that under those circumstances, those areas become not only hotter, but they become drier as well. And that's a problem. If you get hotter and wetter, it's easier to navigate than if you get hotter and drier. So we have quite a high vulnerability there. Just as a proxy of that, when we talk about global mean temperature rises of, let's say, the magical 2 degrees. Let's keep the global mean temperature from rising more than 2 degrees. What that translates into in southern Africa is 4 degrees. We warm at twice the global rate. Okay, and so that's just a metric of our vulnerability. We're also vulnerable for social reasons in that we don't necessarily have the intervention structures that allow us to do the adaptation that we need to do. And then finally, when you look at African countries, mostly the African countries are the kind of currently the bottom of the sort of development index. They don't plan to always be there, but that's their current status. And that means that these are mostly emergent economies with all the needs of emergent economies, of having to increase service production, having to increase the utilization of energy and all those factors that go along with it. So in no particular order, these are the global scenarios, and I'll present the global scenario, and then I will reflect on how that might be in Southern Africa. So here we're talking about a world, and I didn't choose the order. This is simply the order that they produced by IPCC. So I'm not saying we're going from best to worst or anything like that, just these are the situations. So the world here shifts towards a more sustainable path, emphasizing inclusive development that respects perceived environmental boundaries. Okay, and we can, sort of imagine through the little graphic the sort of, future that looks like. And they consider this to be a future with relatively low challenges to mitigation of climate change because they've adopted approaches and technologies which reduce consumption, reduce emissions, etc. And the challenges to adaptation are also reduced because of this strong, social capital. So what might that mean in Africa? So under that scenario, we would really have to change our energy systems to being essentially a renewably based energy systems. One of the big opportunities which African development offers us is most of the future cities of Africa actually haven't been built yet. People are going to be living in places where currently, it's a greenfield site in a sense. So in a way, if we're able to intervene with that and create future cities which are much more sustainable, that's an opportunity that we can reach. For this kind of scenario to occur, you have to have a kind of governance system which is probably multi-scale, so people will be thinking about their futures both very locally, and they may identify strongly with that notion of the kind of village within the city. So they might be in a big conurbation, but they're thinking locally. I think we saw an example of that yesterday. Folks in Woodstock weren't thinking of themselves as Cape Towners primarily, or even necessarily South Africans primarily. They were people from Woodstock, and they happened to be embedded in those other levels. How might agriculture work? Africa does have an enormous agricultural potential, and under this scenario, that goes with a sort of a mix of intensification and extensification in some of these high production areas. Africa becomes, in fact, a food exporting continent rather than a food importing continent, and it might be done through a whole mix of different strategies, from smallholders through to medium holders, through perhaps even some large enterprises. Okay, but those are integrated in the landscape with ecosystem services. We'll have to address a bunch of water problems around, especially in Southern Africa, and the way to address that is almost certainly to much more tightly close the water cycles, for instance, in cities. This kind of future, you can imagine, has a moderate economic growth rate, and that's made possible by these sort of strong social services, which means that it's likely to be a relatively high tax future, but people are happy with that because for the taxes that they pay, they get a good service. Here's another future. So this is a techno future, which basically says we kind of give up on trying to control the things like greenhouse gas emissions and engineer our way out of it. It is a high economic growth scenario because there aren't any constraints on economic growth. In fact, that's the objective. But it leads us to some issues, some environmental issues. It leads us to high amounts and rates of climate change. But because we have this strong economic base and strong technological base, we're able to do some adaptation around that. So we kind of technology our way out of the problems that arise. So what might that look like in Africa? So in this scenario, the GDP rise per capita in Africa starts to catch up with the rest of the world. This is the kind of African tiger's view. We get onto the sort of 5% or 6% that is imagined in some of our local scenarios, and people are getting much better off. The population growth tends to stabilize under that scenario because people are better off and better educated, and they don't have to have such large families. The whole of South Central Africa goes over to high production agriculture. So it's maize and soybeans in a big belt across the world. On the other hand, the interior part of Southern Africa starts getting uncomfortably hot. Under this scenario, you're looking at sort of 3.5 degrees to 4 degrees global mean temperature rise, which here translates into 6 degrees global temperature rise. And that makes it impossible, essentially, to do livestock in the central parts of Southern Africa, and makes it extremely uncomfortable for people to live there. So we see a large depopulation of that area. The people who live there are essentially living under air conditioning. We're also seeing problems on the eastern seaboard associated with severe storms. And of course, under this scenario, with carbon dioxide levels sort of pushing the 500 to 600 parts per million, we're getting very close to the point of collapse of marine ecosystems due to ocean acidification. Here's one which many of us living in Africa, and especially Southern Africa, immediately identify with. The whole notion of the world succeeds patchily. In other words, there's a whole sort of a class of global citizens who are doing fine. They've got good educations, they've got jobs, they have access to all sorts of technology. It's very much a services-oriented kind of technology. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who get left behind. And you can imagine that at all kinds of scales. Now, this has slightly lower problems of climate change, because there is investment by those elites in some forms of climate mitigation, but it's hard to do the adaptation because of the fact that so many people are left behind and they don't have the capacity, and so they always have to be brought along. This is easy to imagine. Certainly in South Africa and all over Africa, we're seeing this development of a kind of a rural, an urban slums around areas, pockets of great advantage. And we start seeing exactly, that the elites have access to, many fine things, but the bulk of the population doesn't have. This is quite a low economic growth scenario, simply because although the wealthy are getting wealthier and wealthier and better off, there just isn't a consumer class, so there's a real problem of growth. And that means that we have very high levels of social unrest. Health remains a problem on average. Lifespans are generally short, and the population growth stays relatively high, so the situation perpetuates itself. perpetuates itself. So you can imagine, you know, what does this look like in rural areas? Well, in my imagining, this still results, in fact, in a major movement of people into cities. And the reason for that is that, you know, the conditions in rural circumstances don't get actually any better. And people are thrown back on natural resources and they deplete that natural capital, and therefore they start flooding into cities looking for opportunities. This scenario is the one in which it is in fact most difficult to adapt to global climate change. And the reason for that is that there's an absence of global structures of cooperation because of a breakdown of trust. So this is defined, regions here as being defined as sort of big global blocks, and essentially because they're competing geopolitically globally, they can't come to an agreement on how you know, how to best manage the planet. So often there's relatively high, for instance, climate change going on there, but there's no real mechanism for addressing that. And incidentally, this is the only scenario in the analysis of the IPCC where it is not possible to bring climate change down to reasonable levels. It's actually just not a feasible. They do the sort of economic analysis, and under this scenario is the only one where you can't, in fact, come to a you know, a reasonable future. What might that look like in Africa? What we would see here is essentially a patchwork. Failed states interspersed with places which are actually doing all right. And under that circumstance, illegal migration and illegality, transnational illegality, if you like, you know, becomes a big issue, both politically and economically. And in some cases, that would result, in fact, in armed conflict. So here we have a sort of a climate of insecurity. People don't feel, you know, safe at all, and the kinds of governance that they bring in under those circumstances tends to be big man governments. You know, you appoint a strong guy, okay, because he's going to sort out these problems. We have sort of issues of trade here. Protectionism is kind of the rule of the day. We also have a lot of resource problems, especially ones which are transnational. For instance, fisheries. If you don't have this cooperative environment, you get fisheries collapse occurring. Under this scenario, there are many repeated chronic humanitarian problems because we have these problems of environmental change and social change, but we don't have the cooperative structures to be able to deal with it. So that's the kind of future we can imagine there. Then the final scenario that the IPCC projects is this one called middle of the road, which is essentially incremental bumbling forward, and you know, we can imagine that happening as well. We can't quite agree to do what needs to be done, so we get kind of a little way towards it, and it's a little bit too little and a little bit too late all the time. And you know, yeah, let me leave it there. So what might that look like in Africa? So we make some successes. We get some things right. We do sign, you know, international agreements, and you know, people sort of stick to some of them, but bend them, you know, in other cases. That means that, you know, people in Africa will in fact get better off over the period of time, but not as well off as they could be, and there's still, you know, a great deal of inequity associated with that. And as a result, we remain still kind of at the bottom of the development league. We don't break into the, you know, the kind of winning group there at all. And we are, under this circumstance, would have, you know, many of the problems associated with climate change, perhaps not in their extreme form, but still we would not escape under this circumstance increases in droughts and floods and heat waves. You know, because of our sort of bumbling forward approach, we are able to cope with some of those, but they come at big cost, and that cost is preventing us from getting onto a better development path. They sap our energy and prevent us from, you know, from doing that. Our population in Africa would start to slow down as we sort of approach the demographic transition, but not as soon and not as deeply as we would have hoped. So I've been talking these through to you as narratives, and I think that that's appropriate because that's the kind of space we want to be in. But they're not entirely imagined. You know, there's a huge amount of background economics and emissions work and population work which underlies this. There's a wonderful resource available located at the International Applied Systems Analysis Center in Vienna, where you can go and actually have a look at what some of these futures might look like globally, and it's also broken down by region and by country. So I want to leave that there, and this was intended as a provocation. Okay, that's my imagining of how those futures could play out. The richness of this comes from you counter-imagining that, okay, and thinking about other futures that might be possible and questioning the futures that I might have presented. Thank you.
Brilliant, Bob. Thank you.